profiling or racist or whatever reasons, they can arrest you for whatever they want. So just because the law says they can't doesn't mean they won't. But what happens is if you, as the person that are being approached by the police, get upset or aggressive, you may help turn a situation that was minor into something where it can be much more significant, and force or even death can occur as a result of that. So don't touch an officer. No matter what happens, do not touch an officer. If you are pulled over, you can go from a minor misdemeanor or even an offense that wouldn't be punishable at all by anything other than a ticket to a felony. Okay, so it's really important that you don't touch an officer. If you do, they will charge you with every single crime that they can. So as much as you can, try and remain calm and keep your hands down and don't resist. You have the right to say no to a search of your person, of your car, or of your home. Now, that doesn't mean they won't search anyway, but you should by all means exercise that right. If the police pull you over for speeding and they say, "Can I search your car?" you should say, "No, officer, I'm not consenting to a search." Will they search your car anyway? They could, but at least you have you said that you aren't going to consent to the search. Because once you consent to the search, it's like all over, okay? It's all fair game. Whatever they find in your car, they're going to use. So, and they're going to always say that you consented, but it's always best not to consent to a search. If the police stop you on the street, they can hold you only if they suspect that you were involved in a criminal activity. So they need to have a reason for stopping you. Race or ethnicity alone is not a valid reason to stop you. If you're stopped on the street by a police officer, you should say to the police officer, "Am I free to leave?" And they have to either say no or yes. Okay, and if you're free to leave, then you should calmly walk away. If they say no, you can ask them, "Why are you detaining me?" But they may not tell you, and just remember that, okay? Because what you're doing is you're not going to necessarily stop the arrest, but you're building up the facts so that when if you are charged with something, your attorney can get the case either thrown out or the evidence dismissed because the police were handling things inappropriately. Police are allowed to frisk or pat you down if your outer clothing, if they suspect a weapon. So if they see something sticking out that looks like a knife or a gun, then they're going to pat you down. They can't search your pockets or your bags unless they have probable cause to believe there's some kind of evidence in there of a crime or they're arresting you. Okay, if they arrest you, they're allowed to search you. So if they arrest you for trespassing and they search you and they find cocaine, they're going to charge you with cocaine, and they're allowed to pat you down after they arrest you. In New Jersey, police may not request your ID or demand your name unless they're going to issue a summons. This is not in a car. This is just if you're on the street, okay? If you're on the street, the police stop you, you don't have to give them your name unless they're going to issue a summons. Do you guys may remember that story with the girl down the shore who the police stopped her at the beach? I think it was in Wildwood, and she wouldn't give them her name, and they wanted to issue her a summons for drinking on the beach. She ended up winning a civil rights case against them because it was videotaped and everyone saw, and that case actually just settled for, I think, something like $300,000, so like a good amount of money. But what happened is they asked her for her name and she said no. Now, if they were going to give her a summons for drinking on the beach, she had to give the name, but that ended up escalating into such a crazy situation that she ended up winning a civil rights case. So for her, the lucky part about that was it was videotaped by a lot of people. If you are driving on the street and the police stop your car, you do have to give the police your registration, your insurance, and your license, okay? So best practice, if you are concerned about police and police brutality and any issues with that, when the police come over your car, put your hands on the steering wheel. Just leave them there. And then wait till they come over so they can see your hands. And then you can say, can I move my hands to get my license or my registration? Police can search your car if they have a warrant, or if you give them permission, or if they develop probable cause after they stop your car that they'll find something illegal in it. Now, if the police come over to your car and they see on the driver's seat a bag of marijuana or cocaine, let's say something that we know is going to be illegal, they can search your car where the cocaine is because they see it, okay? But if they didn't see that, they can't just automatically search your car. And you should always tell police officers that they want to search your car. No. They can order the driver out of the car, but they can't order a passenger out of a car unless they have a specific safety concern. Again, do we see these things happening all the time? Absolutely, okay? So what I'm telling you is sort of what they're allowed to do. It's not what happens in the real world. I know in the real world that if you get pulled over and you're a minority, that there's a good chance that the police aren't going to do a lot of these things. But you need to know what the rights are. And what you shouldn't do, though, is get into a fight with the police officer about the law, okay? You shouldn't say, well, I know that you can't search my car. Just say, I don't consent to the search, okay? Just exert your rights, but don't get in an argument about it, because you're not going to win the argument. It's just going to result in you getting hurt or some violence being taken against you. If you're suspected of driving under the influence, the police can ask you to take an alcohol screening test. If you refuse, you'll face the same penalties that you would as if you were committed or convicted of the DUI offense. In your home, so we talked about car, we talked about the street, we're going to talk about the home. In your home, police must have a warrant to enter unless there's an emergent situation, like someone's screaming or something's going on, or if you let them in, obviously, if you consent. So if they have a warrant, you should always ask to see it so you know what's going on and what it says. Make sure it's your right house, it's not a different house. If they search you, they can search you and whatever is close by. It doesn't necessarily mean if you're arrested in your home that they can search the whole house. And one thing's really important is that you should prepare your family for what to do in the event that you do get arrested, who to call, where you're going to be, what to do. And then the final thing I'm just going to talk about briefly, because Raphael is going to get into a lot of information about your Miranda rights, which I know you've probably heard of. And Preston's going to talk to us a little bit about civil rights and what types of cases you can have. But if you are not under arrest, you are allowed to videotape the police in New Jersey as long as you're in a public spot. Okay, so as long as you stay within a public location and you're not arrested, stay away. Like, don't get yourself in the middle of the situation, but you are allowed to videotape the police in New Jersey. So if anything happens and you do get arrested, try and remember as much information as possible. Badge numbers, patrol cars, and witnesses, right? Witnesses are key because witnesses win or lose civil rights cases and criminal defense cases, and they often disappear, right? You're like, oh, like 5 people were there. But you can't rely upon the police to get down the names of everyone that would happen to be there when they were doing something maybe illegal. So if you are in a situation with friends and family, you should talk about it. If anything ever happens to us, make sure you get the names of other people so that, you know, we have someone to talk to. So hopefully this was a little helpful to you guys about what your rights are when police stop you in the street, in the car, in your home. But remember, if you do get arrested and you think the police did violate your rights and you were injured in some way, you should really reach out to an attorney and talk to them about whether you have a civil rights case. So I'm going to refer it over now to Raphael, and he will tell you about Miranda.
I just wanted to thank everyone who's joining the call today during this COVID-19 pandemic that's affecting hundreds of thousands of people in the United States and across the world. And I think even scarier is COVID is really exposing all of the flaws that's within our system, right? We see it in education, we see it in healthcare, we see it in unemployment. And I think the reason why we're here this evening, and I think the silver lining through all the trauma that we faced in this less than a year, coming up to a year in March, is the renewed collective interest in law enforcement and the potential injustices against the most vulnerable. In regards to myself, from Philly, went to law school, and then one of my first jobs out of law school was becoming a prosecutor. So I was on the opposite end of the aisle of Robin, and I used to prosecute cases on behalf of the city of Philadelphia. But I knew I wanted to represent people, so now I'm working as an attorney at Eric Shore doing cases on behalf of victims of personal injury, workers' compensation, employment, and civil rights cases. And for me, I'm someone who's both a supporter of the police, but also at the same time holding police accountable. And I think that's really important distinction, and it's important in knowing our rights. So Robin did a really good overview of the Fourth Amendment, and I'm going to talk about the Fifth Amendment today in the limited time that we'll discuss it. So with the Fifth Amendment, like, why is it important? How does it affect my life? And most importantly, what do I do when myself, my loved ones, or my friends need to do it if my rights are violated? So in order to understand why it's important, we also need to understand how we got there. So in the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, also with the women's rights movement, it was a really special time in American jurisprudence that had a profound change in the way that Americans were afforded rights. So in the seminal case that really distinguished the Fifth Amendment was Miranda v. Arizona. And in that case, specifically, Miranda was arrested. He was taken down into custody. He was interrogated for more than 2 hours. And then he gave a signed and written confession. And what's funny is when he put that confession down, he stated on the top in scribbled letters, "I know my rights," even though he confessed. So he was found guilty, and it was later appealed to the Supreme Court. So what the Fifth Amendment says, as we understand it now, is that we all have a right against self-incrimination if we're under custodial interrogation. So in TV, so if you're watching a crime documentary on Netflix, or if you're watching Law and Order, we always hear those Miranda warnings, right? We've heard it a million times. But what does it really mean? So specifically, there's no magic words to invoke, but something that would be really helpful to say if you believe you're under custodial interrogation by any law enforcement officer is, number one, I'm declining to answer any questions without a lawyer present. And then second, and probably more importantly, is your actions. And that specifically is to stop talking. Intuitively, we want to talk to law enforcement, right? Because us as citizens, we don't necessarily know the law, but we want to appease police, right? And sometimes police interrogations could be really intimidating. But really what Miranda warnings are supposed to do is ensure people who are likely to be accused of crimes that they're aware of Fifth Amendment rights, and that the burden is always on the police to positively inform citizens before they're arrested and those words are used against them. So I thought Robin did a really good job of outlining the specific real-life examples that you may encounter police. So, on the street, in the car, in the home. And specifically, when I think about the law, I always want to talk about like real life practical examples. So specifically, let's say when you encounter the police while you're in your car. So let's say Eric just had a great restaurant meal, doing all the safety precautions, eating outside with his mask on, and he's driving back home to Cherry Hill. And let's say all of a sudden, lights and sirens go off, and Eric is pulled over by the cops. What's always happening in this situation, right? The cop, as soon as Eric pulls down his window, says, "You know why I pulled you over?" And specifically, you're going to probably give an incriminating response. This is probably one of the most common examples of how you give voluntary information that will be used to incriminate you, right? So probably Eric in this situation was saying, well, I was doing 75 into 55. That's why. So it's important to really distinguish the fact that when you're speaking with police, that you're careful of what you say. Another example that I think of is if you're on the street, let's say Ben is coming out of the Cherry Hill Mall. Let's say the police are investigating a crime, specifically a robbery. And Ben matches the description of the potential robber. Let's say he's wearing a blue hoodie. Remember to always be respectful, right? Because in practical, real-life situations, just because you may know the law and just because you're aware of what your rights are, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be disrespectful to police. So one of the main things that I would advise to everyone here is a very simple question when the police approach you. Am I under arrest? If you are under arrest, say the magic words that we just discussed. Specifically, I'm declining to answer questions without a lawyer present. And most importantly, stop talking. If the answer is no, that means that you are free to leave. So that means you calmly walk away from that situation. Another situation that happens when you may be interrogated by the police is if there's a search warrant. So if police come and there's probable cause to your home, always double check to see if there's a proper paperwork in order for them to actually enter your home. And specifically, be aware that during an investigation or if you're being interrogated by the police, either at your home, on the street, in the car, or even at the police station, that police can lie. So that's something that's really shocking when I tell people, but police do this very often. Sometimes it's something that might be less harmful. Some of the lies could be, everything will go easier for you if you talk to me, or I've been speaking with your co-defendant and we know everything and we have your DNA that's in the crime scene. So just be wary of what police say to you, because it may not be always the right situation. Those are the common examples that I could think of in regards to being stopped and questioned by police. Please don't hesitate to talk to myself, to Preston, who's going to be speaking next about civil rights, and also to Robin. Specifically, we can always speak to you for free in regards to any type of case, if that's criminal, personal injury, workers' compensation, or any legal issues that can come up. So specifically, what you can do in the future is, if you're not charged specifically criminally, you can always file an internal affairs complaint, even anonymous, with the police district. And if charged criminally, you can actually file a motion to suppress actually the statement or anything that's recovered in regards to that statement. So I want to hand it over to my colleague, Preston, so he can talk a little bit about civil rights.
Thank you so much, Raphael. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. I'm Preston Satchel, as some of you already know. I'm an employment and civil rights attorney with the law offices of Eric Shore, and I'm here today to discuss civil rights lawsuits, specifically in New Jersey, but a lot of this information also applies to Pennsylvania as well. Now, if there's anything you take from what I am saying this evening, please, if you have any questions whatsoever with respect to your legal rights, or if you would like to have a conversation with any of us about something else, we are all available. Give us a ring, shoot us an email. We are happy to discuss everything. Now, as Robin mentioned, Rise Against Hate, the organizer of our webinar this evening, has collected very troubling information with respect to the state of policing in Cherry Hill. And I suspect that this is not just a Cherry Hill problem. This is a statewide, this is a countywide, this is a nationwide issue that we are all dealing with in 2020. So Robin and Raphael have already given you great advice with respect to how to protect your rights, your dignity, and your safety when dealing with police officers or representatives of the state. And I'd like to speak with you more specifically about your civil remedies after that encounter is done, and you think that something was wrong about your encounter with the police. So first, I'd like to start with a very base premise that we're moving on. Racism is still very much alive in our community, in our state, and in our nation. Working at the law offices of Eric Shore, we received dozens of calls every single day about people, whether it be at the hands of the police or at the hands of their employer, who are subjected to racism in their community. For instance, in the past few weeks, I've had someone who has had nooses show up at their workplace after the George Floyd protests, and they just reached out to us for that. I've had someone who mistakenly bumped into someone and stepped on their shoe and was called a vile racist slur. And people who died exclusively on their skin color. Now, both our firm, the legislature, a lot of good organizations such as Rise Against Hate are making progress towards solving these issues in our community so that we can finally live up to our American ideals of everyone being created equal and being treated equally regardless of our skin color. But as we all know, this is an uphill battle, and this is not going to be solved in a day. What's particularly concerning, though, is that racism is present in law enforcement. Now, if you take my employment cases, my employment clients, if you're subjected to racism, obviously it's terrible and you should pursue your legal rights. But at that point, you can end your relationship with your employer. You can end your relation. You can decide not to go to a particular employer because they may have a bad reputation for treating their employees badly. Unfortunately, you cannot opt out of interacting with law enforcement. Once they decide it's time to have a discussion or time to have an interaction, there's no opting out of that. So it's as, if not more important, that we all work together to eradicate racism in law enforcement, because we are forced, and our community members and our neighbors are forced to have to deal with law enforcement on a daily basis, right? So they have sworn to protect and serve us, and not all, but at least some of them have continued to treat our neighbors differently based on the color of their skin. And we can see that in Rise Against Hate's report that says that people of color, and specifically African Americans, are disproportionately affected with respect to the use of force and in marijuana arrests. So what do we do about this? As I stated at the beginning, it is very important that as soon as you feel that you were treated differently because of your race or because of another factor, or if you just feel that your interaction with the police was wrong, you should contact a civil rights attorney such as myself, such as Raphael, such as Robin, to discuss your matter. The reason why it's important that you contact us as soon as possible is because, and I'm going to talk about the statutes a little bit later, but all of these statutes have time limits. After a certain amount of time, you are out of time to assert your rights under these statutes. And these statutes can be as little as 90 days after the interaction. So it's very important that you reach out to us as soon as possible. So what do we do about this? What tools do we have so that we can help you assert your rights when you've been discriminated against by the police? In New Jersey, at least, we have a statute called the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination, and it's one of the most comprehensive civil rights statutes in the United States. I can speak for many minutes about the law against discrimination, but for the purposes of this webinar, there's a section stating that in places of public accommodation, and the law treats police officers as a public accommodation, that they cannot discriminate against you because of your race. And we have taken, both as a firm and myself individually, have taken cases under this statute. And one that comes to mind was a young lady who was discriminated against on the basis of her race on a highway in the state of New Jersey. And we were able to get a successful recovery for her because of the statements and the camera that the police officer had in their car and recorded the conversation. So there is recourse, and the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination is one of several statutes that you can use to help both yourself and your community to hopefully one day eradicate discrimination and racism by the police in our community. There are other laws. There are other statutes, both state and federal. I will not go into them here. But if you feel that you were discriminated against, I cannot stress enough that you should contact an attorney as soon as possible to get that addressed. So with that said, unless there's anything else from Robin or Raphael, I can send it back to Ben.
I was just going to mention briefly that the three of us will put our contact information in the chat so that you guys have it if you need it. I just wanted to echo one thing that Raphael said. Just keep in mind, you'll never talk yourself out of arrest. A lot of people think like, oh, I'm just going to talk to the police and I'll talk myself out of arrest. I don't know anyone that's actually happened to. Sometimes people are like pretty good about talking themselves out of speeding tickets. I've never talked myself out of a speeding ticket. So, just be careful about that. And, another thing, like sometimes it feels like you're up against a hard battle if you're getting arrested or against the police. But I've actually won motions to suppress on Fifth Amendment rights where I'll just briefly tell you guys this because it was an interesting story, but I had a client who made a confession, and when it came time for the motion to get the confession, tried to get it thrown out, the officer who read the Miranda rights, you have the right to remain silent, anything you can say will be used against you. I asked him, he said, I read the Miranda rights to him, and then he said, and I said, well, wait, before we get to what he said, what were the Miranda rights? What did you say? And he's like, well, Miranda. And I said, well, no, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? And he goes, Judge, can I go out to my car to get the card that I have that has the Miranda rights on it? And he had been like a police officer for like 15 years. So if you don't know Miranda rights, like 15 years into being a police officer, you probably didn't read them to somebody. And the judge threw out the confession. So, it's really important to not have to get there, but we do these things and we're trying to teach people what their rights are so that we don't have to, win by a good question or a happenstance. So we're, really happy we're able to talk to you guys. And if you do have any other questions, put them in the chat and the three of us are happy to answer.